Now, from the Pope John Paul II Cultural Center in Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
Good evening. Good to see you all. Welcome to The World Over Live. We are so glad you decided to join us tonight. For all of you confused about the worldwide clergy sex abuse controversy you've been hearing so much about, we have a lot to share with you this evening. It is a show you and your friends will not want to miss. Several bishops have resigned and lawsuits are being filed here in the U.S. against the Vatican. Philip Lawler, the director of CatholicCulture.org, is here tonight to discuss the continuing controversy. And later we'll bring you an encore presentation of my recent interview with author and screenwriter Frank Cottrell Boyce about his faith, his art, and his latest book, Cosmic. If you have a question about the church sex abuse scandal or something else is on your mind, you can give us a call, 1-800-221-9460 in the U.S. and internationally, 205-271-2980, or drop us an email at worldover@EWTN.com. Let's get down to business. Here's the brief. News from the world over this week. Sex abuse by priests continues to make headlines around the world this week. Bishops' resignations were announced in Belgium, Ireland, and Germany. Bishop Roger Vanilou of Bruges, Belgium, resigned Friday after admitting that he sexually abused a boy about 25 years ago. He was Belgium's longest-serving bishop. Pope Benedict on Wednesday accepted the resignation of Irish Bishop James Moriarty of Kildare and Leyland. Bishop Moriarty admitted to mishandling sexual abuse cases while in the Dublin Archdiocese. And Bishop Walter Mixa of Augsburg, Germany, on Wednesday offered his resignation over physical abuse allegations during the 1970s and 80s. The abuse allegations were not sexual in this case. All three bishops issued apologies to the victims and the faithful with their resignation announcements. The Bishops' Conference of England and Wales also issued an apology for what it described as the profound scandal of sex abuse by clergy. And on Wednesday, Pope Benedict again took time during his weekly address to comment on the clergy abuse scandal. The Holy Father recounted his tearful meetings with 8 abuse victims in Malta this past weekend. He said he shared in their suffering, prayed with the victims, and assured them of church action. There have been a few instances of misreporting on this story. The Associated Press and NBC News reported that the Holy Father's comments on Wednesday were his first on the matter. The New York Times reported it as a rare, direct comment. In fact, the Pope has spoken out on sex abuse in the church repeatedly. Just last week in Malta, in a recent pastoral letter to the people of Ireland when he visited the U.S. in 2008, in Australia in July of 2008. I could go on and on, but I will stop there. More on this in our next segment. And the leading publication in Germany, Der Spiegel, also issued an inaccurate report. This week they revealed that the former Vicar General of Munich, who served under then Archbishop Joseph Ratzinger, claimed he was pressured by archdiocesan officials to take the fall over the reassigning of a pedophile priest in the 1980s, thus releasing Pope Benedict from direct responsibility in the case. However, in an interview with the Wall Street Journal on Wednesday, Father Gerard Gruber, the vicar, clarified that he was merely under time pressure to approve an official statement from the Archdiocese, and he made it clear that he never consulted Archbishop Ratzinger on the matter. He is still taking full responsibility for the decision to reassign the priest and said he was not coerced to shield the Pope in any way. Der Spiegel has yet to issue a clarification, a retraction, or a correction. And 2 new lawsuits have been brought forward by victim's attorney Jeff Anderson. On behalf of an alleged victim of Father Lawrence Murphy, a deceased Wisconsin priest, Anderson is suing the Vatican in U.S. federal court for sexual abuse claims against Murphy. The late priest reportedly abused more than 200 boys from 1950 to 1974. The Vatican's U.S. attorney said the Holy See had no role in the abuse cases and dismissed the suit as a publicity stunt. A judgment against the Vatican would be a first. Similar attempts to sue the Vatican in U.S. courts have been summarily rejected. And in a L.A. federal court, Cardinal Roger Mahony and Cardinal Archbishop of Mexico City Norberto Rivera are being sued by an alleged victim claiming the two conspired to shelter a Mexican priest in L.A. and Mexico. The lawsuit alleges that then Bishop Rivera and Cardinal Mahony shuttled the since laicized Nicolas Argular Rivera between the U.S. and Mexico during the 1980s to shield him from prosecution on alleged pedophile charges. Parishioners in both countries maintain that the priest molested young boys. Aguilar remains at large in Mexico. He is wanted in the U.S. for 19 felony counts of lewd conduct since fleeing to Mexico in 1988. Respective spokesmen for Cardinals Rivera and Mahony have denied any wrongdoing in the matter. And President Barack Obama on Wednesday opened discussions with Senate leaders on the upcoming Supreme Court vacancy. Here's what he had to say when asked by a reporter whether he would be willing to nominate someone who did not support abortion rights. Take a look.
I am somebody who believes that women should have the ability to make often very difficult decisions about their own bodies and issues of reproduction. I don't have litmus tests around any of these issues, but I will say that I want somebody who is going to be interpreting our Constitution in a way that takes into account individual rights, and that includes women's rights.
The president said he would submit a nominee to the Senate by May. And 2 U.S. bishops have taken stands against dissenting Catholic support for President Obama's health care overhaul. Bishop Thomas Tobin of Providence, Rhode Island, has asked the Catholic Health Association to remove the diocesan-sponsored St. Joseph Health Services from its membership rolls. You may remember that CHA President, Sister Carol Keehan, was a key supporter of the president's health care plan in defiance of the U.S. bishops who believed the legislation would fund and expand abortion coverage. And Bishop Lawrence Brandt of Greensburg, Pennsylvania, has barred the Sisters of St. Joseph of Baden from advertising in diocesan media. Bishop Brandt said the action was in response to the religious order's public dissent from the bishops on the health care legislation. And the Vatican announced on Friday that they will finance new research into the potential use of adult stem cell treatment. With an initial investment of €2 million, the project involves research and treatment using intestinal stem cells, a relatively new field. Cardinal Renato Martino, a Vatican official, said that the Vatican fully supports the project because it does not involve embryonic stem cells. Father Robert Gall, professor of ethics at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome, further explains.
So this new project falls exactly within the Catholic Church's ethical guidelines because it's respectful of human life, it advances science, and it will advance medical care to help patients who are suffering from hundreds, maybe thousands different kinds of pathologies.
The University of Maryland's School of Medicine is heading up the project. Project leaders say it will be 2 or 3 years before they'll know whether therapy using intestinal stem cells would be feasible. And 2 U.S. bishops' appointments were announced this week. Orlando Bishop Thomas Wensky will be heading down to Miami. He'll replace Archbishop John Favalora, who's retiring. And the vacancy in the Diocese of Springfield, Illinois, has been filled by Chicago Auxiliary Bishop Thomas Paprocki. We wish both the new bishops the very best. And here's more evidence that the faithful wishing to participate in the traditional Mass are being underserved. A poll of churchgoers in Germany found that among those who attend Mass regularly, once a week or more, a full 1/4 would attend the Latin Mass instead, and another 2/3 would attend at least monthly on feast days, or at least on occasion if given the opportunity. That leaves a mere 7% who say they would never participate in the extraordinary form of the Roman Rite. Those results were consistent with a poll of the U.S. faithful conducted last year. Bishops around the world have been slow, to say the least, in implementing Pope Benedict's 2007 motu proprio, expanding and encouraging the use of the traditional Latin Mass. And I wanted to take a moment to wish Mother Angelica a belated happy birthday. Mother turned 87 on Tuesday. She'll be happy to know, as I hope most of you are, that our latest collaboration, the prayers and personal devotions of Mother Angelica, is topping the Catholic bestseller list this week. It sits at #1 on the list. How's that for a birthday gift? Happy birthday to Mother, and thank you for all of you who supported the book. Up next, we'll return to discuss the ongoing controversy surrounding the sex abuse allegations occurring all over the world. Journalist and author Phil Lawler is here. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
My first guest is a veteran journalist. He's the former editor of Catholic World Report. In 1996, he founded Catholic World News Online. He's currently director of CatholicCulture.org and the author of The Faithful Departed, The Collapse of Boston's Catholic Culture. Here to discuss the ongoing clergy sex abuse scandal and to give us his perspective as a native Bostonian, please welcome to the World Over, Phil Lawler. Phil, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, good to see you again after
It's been a while.
too many years. Let's talk for a moment about all of what we're seeing. Is this, and I've heard this from a lot of quarters in the church, is this a media-driven event?
Yes and no. The media has certainly been calling attention to it, and particularly in the United States, if the media hadn't called attention to it, I don't know if it would be out yet.
Right.
On the other hand, it's not made up. These are real stories of real scandals.
Are you concerned about the unrelenting drumbeat of them, though?
Absolutely.
I mean, a lot of these stories, we have to say, and we'll get into the specific cases a bit later, a lot of these cases have already been tried. Some of these people have been paid settlements, not once, but twice in some cases, and yet it's being reported as if it just happened last Sunday.
There is a feeding frenzy. There's no question about that. And a lot is being drummed up, as you say, that has been already resolved. And there's another factor here that I think is important to realize. It's the way that the victims' lawyers have manipulated the media. And frankly, I don't mind that as much as I mind the media being manipulated, because I'm a media person.
Yeah. How were they being manipulated?
Well, they're good, aggressive lawyers doing the best for their clients. They're looking for deep pockets, and the Vatican has deep pockets. So they're looking for a way to make the Vatican a possible recipient of a lawsuit.
Let's talk about Jeff Anderson, who is central to this. Jeff Anderson is, at last count, the $60 million man, but chances are he's made hundreds of millions of dollars.
That's very old.
Yeah, that's an old figure. That was 2003, I think. But it appears Jeff Anderson is the primary plaintiff's attorney representing a lot of these alleged victims, and he sued all over this country. Now he's trying to drag the Vatican into litigation, as we heard during the headline segment.
Right.
The question is he an appropriate source, given that he seems to be the only source and the leak of a lot of these letters that are in the public forum now?
He's certainly not an appropriate source to be treated as if he's a neutral party. At the very least, I think a reporter quoting Jeff Anderson has to point out that this is a man who's engaged in the lawsuit. This is not a neutral party. And that's not what's happening.
Yeah, no, and there's also a kind of sad element here that I don't think has been reported enough. First of all, Jeff Anderson, and this is not his fault, his daughter was molested by a former priest who was a psychologist at the time, or a psychiatrist at the time. So there is a kind of personal motive here, but more than that, we have this organization, SNAP. Tell us about SNAP, who they are. This purports to be a victims group.
It is, and it also is very aggressive and effective in representing victims' rights and also in manipulating the media. And I'm not inclined to criticize those people so much as to criticize the reporters who are being manipulated, because it's their responsibility to get an objective or at least a balanced perspective, and they're not even looking for it.
Well, what I found interesting was the day that Lori Goodstein's story broke in the New York Times, the flood, that was the beginning of the floodgates being opened. Snap just happened to be standing in St. Peter's Square that same day when it hit so that they could be covered. As it turns out, we did a little digging. Jeff Anderson is one of the primary supporters, financial supporters of Snap. He's given tens of thousands of dollars. The nearest we could find, Forbes magazine had a little piece on this, one little blurb. No one ever covers this dimension of it, that you have a deep-pocketed lawyer funding one of the primary mouthpieces, if you will, for the victims group. That's not to diminish the victims' suffering or the victims themselves. I want to talk about them in a moment. But isn't it incumbent upon journalists to look at all the facts and at least include this as they report this story?
Absolutely, to include that, and also to seek expertise. You mentioned that there's been a lot in the news segment. There's been a lot of misreporting here. A lot of reports that have been based on a simple misunderstanding of canon law. Now, canon law is an area of expertise that the average reporter wouldn't have, but you can get help. You can consult with someone. And had you consulted, you wouldn't have the AP story saying that then Cardinal Ratzinger was responsible for the failure to remove this Father Murphy in Milwaukee from ministry. That's just canonical nonsense. And had you got the expert advice, you'd know that.
And I want to include you in on this conversation. If you have a question, and I know many of you do, I've been getting a lot of your emails and calls, 1-800-221-9460 is the number. Internationally, you can reach us at 205-271-2980, or just drop us an email, worldover@EWTN.com. We will get to those, and I've set aside a little portion of the show so we can really have some back and forth, since this is a live show, and it's one of the nice things about having a live show. Let's talk for a moment about the contextual reportage of this. There seems to be an exclusive eye for any abuse happening in the Catholic Church to the exclusion of anything happening elsewhere. To what do you attribute that?
Several things. One, frankly, I'm proud of, that the Catholic Church is held to a highest standard. I welcome that. We should be. Another is there are a lot of people who don't like the Catholic Church, and they have their own reasons, and they have their own agendas. And I think particularly when you see the ferocity, the vituperation that's directed against Pope Benedict, you recognize that there are a lot of people who have their own reasons for wanting to diminish the authority of the teaching magisterium and diminish the prestige of the Holy Father. And they're climbing on board as well.
It's clear that the target of Jeff Anderson's latest case, the case he filed just the other day against the Vatican, seeks to drag Pope Benedict and the entire Vatican, as you said earlier. This is a deep pocket, and we've never had anyone reach into it. He clearly wants to open up that line of litigation. Do you think there's any merit here? Will this case proceed?
None whatsoever. It is a publicity stunt. The Pope is sovereign. He is not answerable in a court of law in the United States or anywhere else short of St. Peter. He's immune from lawsuits. But it's intriguing that a month, 6 weeks ago, if you had announced that someone was suing the Pope, everyone would have laughed. But now the climate of opinion has been prepared for this.
Right.
Anderson he's a clever man.
Well, this is what Bob Bennett was saying a few days ago, last week, and we had him on the show, the great trial attorney. Bob was saying this is, when you don't have a case, you go create an atmosphere so your case can thrive. And that's what Anderson is clearly doing. And the discovery part of this could be far more dangerous than the lawsuit. It's the discovery. Whether he wins or loses, that discovery process could be ugly.
But it won't go that far. And if it does go that far, and if there is discovery, I have absolutely no doubt that the facts will vindicate Pope Benedict. It may be ugly on the way, because I think there are others who will not be shown in a very favorable light. But everything that I've seen about the abuse scandal since I began studying it tells me that Pope Benedict is the good guy.
And you were there at Ground Zero in Boston watching this thing play out 10 years ago. Your thoughts on what happened there and how that's related to what we're seeing play out on the global scale. You'll remember, And people who were here in my circle, members of the National Review Board, have told me, when we went to Rome and discussed this problem with them in 2001 and 2002, we were told repeatedly, this is an English-speaking problem. It's clear that that is not the case any longer.
It's not the case, and I have to tell your viewers, brace yourself. It's not over. It's sweeping through Europe now. The other shoe is going to drop eventually, the mission territories. It's inevitable that we'll be hearing those stories as well. It's a worldwide problem. It was discovered first in the United States, and it really broke into the big time in Boston because of the peculiarities of the American judicial system, which allowed people to open up files, and that's what got the whole thing going, but it's a universal problem.
Now, you in your book identify three, if you will, aspects of the sex abuse crisis. What are those three aspects, and how do they relate to what we're seeing today?
Well, thank you for the question, because this is something I'm anxious to get out. People talk about the sex abuse crisis, and there are really more than one. There is the crisis created by a very small percentage of priests who behaved iniquitously. A large number, unacceptably large number, but a very small percentage. But in a way, that's an individual sin, and we understand that. The second crisis, which compounded the damage done by the first, is the crisis caused by bishops who did not do their job, who did not discipline the priests who were molesting children. Had the bishops done their job, taken these priests out of ministry when they should have and could have in the 60s and 70s, the crisis would not have mounted to the dimensions that it now is.
Yet none of them have really suffered any penalty either inside or outside of the church.
Very
few resignations we're now seeing, but no one's been removed, no one's been sent to prison over this, except the French case. Cardinal Lawler was shipped to Rome. Some see that as it is an ecclesial step down, but in the eyes of the world, it looks like he inherited St. Mary Major's.
Well, and more to the point, he's the only American who has resigned because of the mishandling of this crisis. Now, dozens, scores of American bishops botched the handling of sexual abuse. Only Cardinal Lawler was penalized by being asked to resign. And I mean, if you consider that the church in this country has lost $2 billion at least, thousands of parish closings, schools closings, who knows how many souls lost to the faith, and only one of the main administrators has paid with his job in any other corporation, any other way of life, there would be greater accountability, and there still should be here.
What's the third aspect of this crisis?
Well, the third aspect that nobody wants to talk about is the crisis of homosexual influence in the priesthood. Now, this is the third rail to discuss it. And Cardinal Bertone, the Vatican Secretary of State, ran into the soup recently when he dared to discuss it, when he made the observation that the sex abuse scandal is largely fueled by homosexuality. Well, this is a statement of fact. 80 to 90% of the cases that we're talking about are male on male, same sex.
Now, where are you getting this? This is the John Jay criminal report?
The John Jay reports, but it also matches the Vatican figures that were disclosed by the chief prosecutor there. It's overwhelmingly male on male, and it's
because these are old. These aren't little kids. These are people 11 and older.
Here's the thing. That's right.
Which wouldn't qualify in the clinical sense as pedophilia.
And here's the thing that it's important to realize: all of the most notorious cases, all of the cases you've read the most about,
Gagan, Shanley,
Gagan, not Shanley, involve true pedophiles. These are molesting young children. Now, Shanley, we had teenagers, teenage boys. And the cases that you hear about, the Murphy case, that was little children. These are true pedophiles. They get the headlines, and it's really disturbing, as it should be. But there are an awful lot more cases. The vast majority of the cases that you're not hearing about involve teenagers.
Now, the other side of this, and I've been speaking, as you can imagine, to a lot of bishops, a lot of people who were involved in 2002 and writing up the charter and all of that, they say, look, the church, because of this bloodletting that took place over the last 8 or 9 years, the church is probably the safest place for children today because of the screenings in place, the protocols and procedures that have been implemented by the bishops, because of the pressure cooker they were under in 2001, in 2002. Do you believe that?
More or less, but there's a flaw in the logic. And the flaw is that the men who are being asked to implement these policies are, for the most part, the same men who failed to implement the policies 10 or 15 years ago. And personnel is policy.
Yeah. So some of the same people who permitted some of this to go on are now implementing.
If you're inclined to be suspicious of the American hierarchy, you're probably still inclined to be suspicious.
Let's go to the phones. Ed from Pennsylvania, you're on the World Over Live. What's your question, Ed?
Yeah, do you think groups with their own agendas and hatreds are sort of hiding behind and using groups like SNAP as a vehicle for their own ends, like Cardinal Hoyer's cancellation tomorrow at the Basilica in Washington?
Go ahead.
There's no question in my mind that there are people who are delighted to jump on this bandwagon. On the other hand, let's be fair. The victims have been very badly hurt. Yes. I have an awful lot of sympathy for them, and I understand their anger, and I think it's important not to dismiss them as being some sort of malefactors here. That the victims are the victims.
Well, there was a piece I read today. There's a group of victims, some American victims, who met with Pope Benedict when he visited the United States. They're asking for sort of a group gathering to come together on October 31st. Now, you and I know that's Reformation Day. It's kind of an odd day to choose for this sort of healing gathering, but what they'd like to do is to have sort of a prayer meeting there in St. Peter's Square with the Pope in attendance and have a moment where they can sort of feel validated and that someone is hearing them, because as one of these victims said, we hear all about the lawyers, we hear about the suits, we see the headlines, but somewhere in the mix, we are being ignored here. No one's hearing from us. Is that a valid viewpoint?
I think that's a valid viewpoint. The idea of doing a Reformation Sunday does not strike me as a valid Catholic viewpoint. And again, I can easily sympathize with someone who is turned off by the Catholic Church, but to join in the forces of the Reformation is not a Catholic response. I sort of prefer the response.
Their woundedness. I mean, when you read, I mean, when you hear about the horrible abuse,
there's no question.
You know, they will naturally, forever, think of their faith and that horrible abuse as one because of the nature of the abuser.
But you might have heard of the story of a young man who met with the Pope just this past weekend in Malta. And he said, it's a very beautiful story, and he said he'd lost all confidence in the church until meeting with the Pope, and now his confidence is restored, his faith is restored, and he thinks the Pope is a saint.
Yeah,
and he was sort of scolding the Italians for not recognizing what they had.
Tell us about Benedict. I mean, everything I know, everyone I've spoken to, they say he was probably the most voracious in the Vatican about pursuing these cases, seeking justice, even if it meant overturning a few apple carts and upsetting some of his peers. Tell me about what you're hearing.
That's exactly right. And again, it's consistent with what I have learned since I began studying this, that there have been conflicts in Rome for years over how to treat priests accused of abuse or bishops accused of cover-ups. And there are two schools of thought, and Cardinal Ratzinger was very firmly on the school of thought that he wanted to get out the corruption. He wanted to identify it and eliminate it. You remember just before he was elected Pope, that passionate Good Friday appearance when he said we have to purge the filth from the priesthood. Very strong language. You've never heard that language from any other prelate, I don't think.
No,
about
certainly not from a pope.
Certainly not. No. Well, 2 weeks later, he was Pope, or 3 weeks later.
Right.
And it's no coincidence that almost immediately thereafter, the charges against two very powerful clerics, influential clerics, who had been protected for decades, moved forward and they were disciplined. I'm talking about Father Maciel, the founder of the Legion of Christ, and Brother Gino, the oblate, who had a worldwide following as an alleged mystic. And both of them stripped of their priesthood and sent into a life of penance. That was the initiative of the Pope, and it was one of the first things he did upon taking Peter's chair.
Let's go to the phones again. Do we have a caller there? Go ahead, Mary. You're on the World Over Live. What's your question?
Yes, I'm from the Boston area, and I understand that a lot of families took money from the the church and allowed this problem to continue. And also, Mr. Lawler, I enjoyed your book very much.
Thank you.
So you're talking about, you mean they took a settlement, then probably signed confidentiality agreements, which was common for the time period. But, I mean, do you blame those people?
I don't blame them, but I think there's enough blame to be shared here because, you know, something else I've discovered, where the priests knew about it and the bishops knew about it, quite often the police knew about it too. Quite often prosecutors knew about it too. There was a gentleman's agreement, if you will, but it's not the sort of thing gentlemen do to keep this quiet. And that was wrong. And everyone involved should have blown the whistle.
This past week, Peggy Noonan came out with a piece at the Wall Street Journal, and I'll read a little bit of this. It said, "The old Vatican needs new blood. They need to let younger generations of priests and nuns rise to positions of authority within a new church. Most especially and most immediately, they need to elevate women. As a nun said to me this week, if a woman had been sitting beside a bishop transferring a priest with a history of abuse, she would have said, hey, wait a minute. If the media and the victims don't keep the pressure on, the old ways will continue. As for Cardinal Law, he should not be where he is, nor mitered, nor ringed." Your thoughts on Peggy Noonan's?
I generally am a big fan of Peggy Noonan. I was not a big fan of that column. I didn't think it was logical. I don't see how the gender of the people involved is going to make a big difference. I think that there were a lot of reasons why people in high places in the church wanted to cover up this abuse. They were concerned about image. I don't think it was a male-female thing at all. I don't think it was an old-young thing either, because there's ample evidence that in the past, the Vatican particularly has been very aggressive in pursuit of pedophiles and child abusers. So I don't think it's an old and new thing at all here.
Yeah. And what do you make of not only the isolation, if you will, of the church, not reporting the wider context? There was a rabbi in New York who was just convicted of abusing a boy, teenager, father of 7, grandfather to 24. That story wasn't covered at all. It was covered in the Jewish Times. So there is, there are other groups, whether it's ministers or Baptist ministers. I mean, I've been reading, immersed in all of this. There is a pretty high incidence in these other communities. In fact, in some cases, I've seen some researchers saying there may be more abuse in these other communities. Why don't they get the attention that the Catholic Church is getting in this moment?
The Catholic Church is a popular whipping boy. In fact, statistically speaking, the Catholic Church is much, much safer than American public schools, but you don't hear that. There's much more abuse in the school system. They aren't as centralized as the Catholic Church. They aren't as easy to sue as the Catholic Church. But also there is a political or ideological component here, I think. I think particularly in the stories that have been so critical of Pope Benedict, one of the factors that upsets me is that people are ready to believe the worst.
Right.
And a lot of people, for various reasons, are ready to believe the worst about the church.
On the other hand, Phil, it is awfully hard to the average Catholic watching, to say nothing of the non-Catholic. They turn their news on tonight, and just this week, Belgium, resignation of a bishop. 3 bishops in Ireland have resigned over the last few months. A bishop in Germany. Surely something is going on here.
Something very good is going on. People are being held accountable. This is good news. The bad stuff happened a long time ago. Now we're getting people held accountable. And that's part of, I mean, it's like if you have a bad disease, the doctor tells you we have to eliminate this cancer. And then you have the operation, and the operation isn't fun, but it's definitely progress.
Do you think there's going to be a boomerang effect, that we will see the same sort of accountability we're now seeing in Europe, that could happen in the United States and elsewhere?
I pray for it daily. I think that is the healing that we need, to have bishops take account, own the responsibility for their own misconduct. And I'm not talking about personal scandal. I'm talking about administrative scandal. And if that were to happen, I think it would be the most important thing to restore public confidence in the church. Because, the way you regain confidence when you've betrayed someone is you do something that's against your own interests. You do something that hurts you to do.
Here's a quick email. Weren't the bishops, this is Mary from St. Louis, weren't the bishops merely following the psychological advice, the therapeutic advice given to them at the time when they thought this condition, pedophilia, was curable?
Yes, but that begs a question. Why were they following that advice? Because there were psychologists, good Catholic psychologists of an earlier era, who had said, you've got to get these men out of the priesthood. They had it right in the 50s. Father Gerald Fitzgerald, who made a specialty of treating troubled priests, literally thought that these men should be shipped to an island, live in isolation, and he put a down payment on an island. He was serious.
Yeah, I saw that.
And he had it right.
And Bishop John Darcy, who was in Boston, he was an auxiliary. He certainly, you look at that paper trail, he's the hero of Boston. He saw a lot of this coming.
Yes.
And had vociferously written to the cardinal, this man must seek immediate laicization, was his favorite line. And you'd see that time and time again. Why weren't people listening? It seemed to make sense, basic common sense. Okay, you give the guy a chance the first time, but then he abuses again and again and again, and we're still worried about keeping him in ministry? I mean, it does sort of defy logic after a point.
It took me a very long time, and you saw in my book I wrestled for 100 pages or so with why would you do this? Because even for the self-interest of the bishops, just for their own peace of mind, they should want these men out of action.
We're going to go to a break. When we return, more with Phil Lawler, and then we'll take more of your calls and emails. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over Live. We are joined by Philip Lawler, the author and journalist, author of the book, The Faithful Departed. We have a caller on the line. Go ahead, caller. What's your question? Hello?
Hello?
There you go. Speak.
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Katrina.
Okay, Katrina. What's your question?
I, as a Protestant, want to know how I can... I'm watching on EWTN.
Yes, yes.
And the state of Indiana, and I enjoy your program, Raymond, and I enjoy listening to you. I like your plain-spokenness, and I respect that.
Yes.
As a Protestant, I want to know how I can support my priest. Mother and I were discussing, and I am disgusted by the fact that it's only priests that make the media. 10, 20, 30, 40 years after the case. What happens with the doctors, the lawyers, and the Protestant preachers? And I want to tell my Catholic brethren that they have to be doing something right because this attack would not continue and is straight from the bowels of hell.
Okay. Well, thank you.
I will
thank you for the call.
hang up now and bless you.
Thank you. And thank you for watching. Phil, what would be your advice to this lady? She obviously is sympathetic to the church, but, you know, sees what's going on.
Well, my advice to her would be the same as my advice to Catholics, is to appreciate the priests you have. 95+% of the priests have no involvement with this scandal. Let them know that you support them. They could use a break.
Very good. Phil Lawler, thank you so much for being here. Phil's book is The Faithful Departed, The Collapse of Boston's Catholic Culture. It is a fantastic study of this entire abuse question. He's also available at catholicculture.org and writes voluminously and always incisively. Now I want to take you to an interview we recently did with Cottrell Boyce, Frank Cottrell Boyce. I'm getting my guests confused. He's a screenwriter, and he's penned the international hit Millions in 2004. He writes quite wonderful children's literature. Frank Cottrell Boyce recently joined me from his home in Liverpool, England, to discuss his latest novel, Cosmic, as well as his Catholic faith, which informs his work. Here's the piece. Frank, I want to talk to you about, first, your book, Cosmic. Tell me, where did this title come from? Where did the idea come from? This is a competition, essentially, between fathers and their children to board a spacecraft, a Chinese spacecraft. Tell us about it.
Well, I originally got the idea because a friend of my son's had one of those magnificent growing spurts that 11-year-old boys sometimes have, and he called to the house. We'd been away for a while, and he called to the house, and he opened the door, and he was just like a giant mutant version of himself. He'd really shot up. And that gave me the idea for writing a story about a boy who looked older than his years. And everything else kind of followed from that, really. The whole space thing. I thought, well, what would you do if you could pass for a grown-up when you were 12 years old? And I think all the best stories are about wishes. So what I would have wished for at that age was to go to space. So he ends up going to space.
Mm-hmm. And Liam is your central character, and he's sort of finding his way through this and eventually becomes sort of the model father. I mean, one could almost say, Frank, this is really a celebration or examination, rather, of fatherhood and the importance of fathers, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that came quite late. It was really about kind of, originally I was sort of writing about how kids are made to grow up too fast, or kids want to grow up too fast. And then it kind of hit this thing that he would have to pretend to be his friend's father in order to get away with this. And that started me to think about fatherhood and what he would think of fatherhood. And of course, I had that great Mark Twain quotation over my desk the whole time, which is Mark Twain said that when he was 18 years old, his father was the stupidest man on earth. And he was amazed how much the old man had learned by the time he was 22.
we all come to that realization, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah.
And Liam certainly does in the book, your main character. Tell me about the whole whimsy that's at play here. You know, some of my favorite writers, particularly children's writers, Roald Dahl and so many others, they seem to find their way, particularly in this book. There's almost an homage to Roald Dahl here, of course, famous for Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and James and the Giant Peach, in the sense that you have children and their parents competing in a competition similar to Charlie and his adventures in the Chocolate Factory.
Yeah, I mean, I stole all that from an homage. That's right. I didn't steal it. I paid homage.
There you go.
But it's it is taken from the Roald Dahl thing, and it's very different because all the parents in that are really hateful and they all get really badly punished. Whereas in mine, they all kind of eventually they all sort of come good. I think. But definitely that whole kind of that's the best book about parenthood. I think the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory one, because you've got all these terrible dysfunctional parents in it. You know.
Yes. Tell me how the role of your faith and how that influences your work. You are a Catholic writer, father of 7 children. How does that influence the way you approach your work, or the way you finish your work, rather?
I mean, just on a pragmatic level, it's especially since I started writing children's books, I find that that was like coming home for me. That was the first time I felt I could put the whole of myself into something. Because before I was a screenwriter and a journalist, and you're always holding back. But in the children's books, I'm giving all of myself, and so my faith is in there all the time. Even though, like, Millions, my first book, is very explicitly Catholic. It's about a little boy who talks to saints.
Yes.
But now it's more that thing of wanting to talk about the good things. So much of what we give to our children is about the bad stuff in life and about being scared, and I just wanted to do something that celebrated all the good things in life.
Some think that Catholic writers sort of carry this weight, that they're hemmed in. I remember reading Flannery O'Connor's letters years ago, and people were saying, you know, don't you feel hamstrung by the rules of the Catholic Church? Do you have that experience as a writer?
Oh, no, completely the opposite. I feel absolutely liberated by it, because before this I was a screenwriter, which is incredibly conventional and incredibly hidebound, and everybody's got to have their journey and everyone's got to learn something. And whereas once I started writing children's books, I felt really liberated to go wherever I wanted to and to break all those rules, because the rules that come from my faith are very different. You know, that you can talk to saints, that's completely fine. As a storyteller, I have a much bigger box of colours to play with writing as a Catholic. You know, I can write about the whole universe, which I couldn't do as a screenwriter.
Yeah, you were a screenwriter and are a very popular one and successful one. You wrote Millions, the screenplay, and later you turned that film treatment and screenplay into a children's book. Why did you decide to go back and revisit this same material?
Well, it wasn't quite like that. We were just about to start making the film, and I went out to supper with the director, who was Danny Boyle, who said to me, "This is a great story, you should write it as a book." And I'd never thought of writing a children's book before. although I love children's books. And sometimes you just need someone to give you that push. And Danny was that person. And it really was like coming home. I went home that night, started writing, and it just poured out of me. And it was just wonderful to be writing it as a book.
That book, as you mentioned earlier, the central character, Damien, there in Millions, he converses with saints. He comes upon a suitcase full of money, and through the course of this journey, communicates with a whole panoply of saints, including St. Clare and others. What do you think we miss about the saints? You seem to be really attracted to them.
Well, it was just, it came from the dynamics of the story. That boy, I wanted a boy to find the money who was like a really good boy. And so I just thought about saints, and that was a kind of good imagery. But as soon as I kind of got my dictionary of saints out and started to read those stories, I realized that although the names are really familiar, you know, we've got railway stations named after saints, and schools and hospitals and blood disorders named after saints, but everyone had forgotten those stories. And for me, it was like finding a bag of money, these amazing stories that I could just pump into the book. And because you kind of come to think of saints as kind of pale and good, and of course you forget all these saints that were completely crazy, like St. Simeon Stylites, who lived on top of a column, and St. Pierre, who fell down a well, and all these amazing stories. So it was just great fun to have them, and to have them talking. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying about not feeling limited by my Catholicism. Everybody else I spoke to thought it was some kind of psychological problem that the boy had. And for me, and for people who are Catholics, it just seemed like a really good solution to his life, that he could talk to saints.
Very natural, yeah. And it comes across that way in the film as well. It's a kind of a natural thing, and you go along with it as you watch it. Let me talk, I want to go back to Cosmic for a moment, because you as a father of 7 certainly did your research at home about the approach to fatherhood. I mean, Liam, who is this 11-year-old boy, 12-year-old boy, who assumes the role of the father and really saves the day. I don't want to ruin the book. But he surely, his approach to fatherhood, how much of that came from your own parenting and your own personal knowledge?
I think it came from, I think writing the book made me think systematically about being a father. I think nobody ever does that. You kind of just start being a father and you kind of take it from minute to minute. And Liam was in this position where he had to sort of sit down and learn from an instruction manual how to do it, which I've never done. So it kind of made me meditate and reflect upon it, and find how funny it was, and what a bizarre situation it is to be totally responsible for somebody else's soul, and to know that they're following you and copying you. And the book ended up being a kind of love letter from Liam to his dad, and from me to my dad, really.
You've been quoted as saying, I think as a Catholic writer, I feel my mission is to do what St. Paul said, and think on what is good, to remind people that life, even in the worst circumstances, contains the possibility of joy. Is that really at the heart of your work?
Oh, absolutely. That's completely what I'm about. Because we're surrounded by people telling us that life is terrible, and I kind of want to focus on the good things. Even in the hardest times, you find good things. And where people are really suffering, that's where you find really strong faith. And often it's where you find really great joy as well. And I love that line from St. Paul, that idea. And that has a kind of really good payoff in the space story, because the astronauts, the Apollo astronauts, were all allowed to take a little personal pack of belongings, which seemed to me a great image of like what is good in life. You know, keep that treasure house of good things and good memories and good thoughts with you all the time on the longest journey.
No, and you get a sense of the book as you go through the book, and I'll just leave this out there again without ruining it for the viewers. There is this sense of greater possibilities and something much larger than ourselves that these characters begin to encounter when they're up in space. And surely that was your broader vision of the universe and God's role in it that is sort of weaving its way in between this story in interesting ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think any man who's my age is a disappointed astronaut, because we can all remember men walking on the moon, and we fully expected that once a few men had gone, we'd all go. So there's always been that kind of urge within me to go. And that seems like a very primal thing, because it's, when you thought about those astronauts, you thought at the same time they're infinitely tiny in this vast universe, and at the same time they're absolutely the center of the universe. And that kind of amazing paradox, for me, is at the heart of my faith.
We're talking to Frank Cottrell Boyce. He's author of the new book, Cosmic, recently released here in the U.S., but it's been out for a while in the U.K. for our listeners and viewers there. Let's talk for a moment about the pop culture and its effect on children. What are your thoughts as a writer, as someone who is part of shaping that culture, and what obligations do you think the culture has, particularly to children and to young minds?
I feel a very strong obligation to my audience. I know that's not the trendiest thing in the world to say, but what I remember reading books when I was 10 and 11, and the values and the ideas, and also the little pleasures that I got from those books have really stayed with me. And I think if you're writing for an audience of 10, 11, 12-year-olds, you're really working with live ammunition. You're working with a very, very powerful chemistry set because you have a huge influence. And I think if you don't treat that influence seriously, why are you doing that, you know? And I have a very, very clear idea, not of what I want to say, because I don't think I'm anybody to say anything, but of the things that I want to celebrate in life and the things that I just don't want to give any room to at all. And I think, you know, our children are bombarded with incredibly kind of negative images to make, you know, to tell them to be fearful, to tell them to be unhappy, to tell them that life is misery. And I'm just out there batting saying, life is really good and families are really great and there's plenty to be happy about and you should focus on those things. And I feel very strongly that that is something that children's books can do, even on a really simple level. Loads of the food that I like because I remember reading the Narnia books and thinking, oh yeah, hot chocolate, Turkish delight. And they really kind of alert you into those. But small pleasures are really important, you know, especially the way the world is going. You know, small pleasures are a very sustainable, nice thing, you know, that they don't hurt anybody, buttered toast and things like that.
Yeah, no, like, I'm with you, Frank. I'm still buying those Wonka bars, looking for the golden ticket.
Hey,
one of these days, we're going to get them. Frank Cottrell Boyce's Cosmic is available at bookstores everywhere in the United States and around the world. Sorry we didn't have more time for Frank's interview. If you're also looking for a book as Mother's Day is approaching, give them my mother. Mother Angelica's Prayers and Personal Devotions is available also at bookstores everywhere. And don't you want the best-selling Catholic book in America? Come on, of course you do. That's all the time we have now for updates and the occasional commentary. You can follow me on Twitter at twitter.com/Raymond Arroyo or the fan page at Facebook. We post exclusive pictures there and show previews and much more, so join us. As always, you can find me at RaymondArroyo.com. Until next week, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, I'm Raymond Arroyo. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye now.